or simply allowing your mind to drift into the quiet hours, this little corner of the night is made just for you. A place where the pace is slow, the voice is soft, and the stories linger in your thoughts long after the last word. Before we begin tonight's tale, may I ask, where in the world are you listening from? I love to imagine these whispered words traveling across time zones, finding their way into darkened rooms, quiet living spaces, or perhaps somewhere where only the glow of a bedside lamp keeps you company. If you enjoy chilling mysteries, haunting legends, and eerie bedtime stories told in the softest voice, I'd be truly grateful if you could tap the like button and subscribe. And to those who have already joined our circle of quiet listeners in the dark, thank you. Tonight's story is one you might not soon forget. So settle in, listen closely, and let the shadows take care of the rest. Night settled over the federal annex like dust over old glass. The reading room lights hummed low, a soft electric breath barely brighter than the moon behind clouded panes. Shelves rose in quiet ranks, metal uprights chilled by decades of air conditioning, labels yellowed to the color of old bone. On a trolley near the far table lay a shallow gray box, lid tied with cotton tape the way conservators prefer. Precise, gentle, unhurried. The accession slip was typed in faded ribbon. Box 7. MISC Defense Research, 1950-1957. In the ledger, its prior requests were zeros running back for years. No one had bothered to write a purpose beside its call number, just the polite bureaucracy of fulfilled, returned. Somewhere in the building, an elevator sighed and went still. The clock did not tick, it clicked, a tiny relay stepping minutes forward. And in that steady mechanical pulse, the cotton tape slid loose, the lid rose, and paper, the true scent of past decades, lifted into the air with a dry whisper. Inside, manila folders stood in a row, their tabs shy of any description beyond instrument codes and dates. One sat crooked, darker than its neighbors, stamped twice in red, classified, and once more across the binding. Eyes only. The card inside the clasp was government plain, typewritten capitals. Operation Hypnos, 1953. Beneath it, photographs rode in glass-signed sleeves, their silver halides browned to a tea color at the edges. A typed summary sheet lay on top, single-spaced paragraphs, margins narrow as audit columns. Paragraph 1 named a sponsoring office that no longer exists. 2 named a supervising physician, Harold E. Whitman, M.D. 3 described a facility at Site P, lower level B, a chamber hermetically sealed for environmental control, a delivery manifold, stimulant vapor mixture, a continuous monitoring suite, optical, acoustic, neurophysiologic. 4 listed 5 civilian volunteers. No names, only initials and year of birth. Photographs followed, each numbered, each holding a moment under 2 bright fluorescent tubes. A painted floor with a grid, a small table bolted to concrete, a microphone as blunt and patient as a night clerk. In the second sleeve, a wider print caught the light. Black tape framed a window of one-way glass. On the far side of that mirror, a room no larger than a school classroom sat waiting. Lamps were shaded to a perpetual afternoon. The walls were smooth, a color between sand and ash. In one corner, a vent with a wire mesh face guarded an aperture the size of a man's palm. Somebody had written with grease pencil on the observation side, baseline 0H. In another sleeve, the camera had stepped back, showing a row of chairs and a rolling cart with a clipboard clipped to its handle. The cart bore a tag with a code, HY3. On the clipboard, a checklist ran down in neat columns. Intake interview completed. Vitals with intolerance. Informed consent signatures on file. And then, said in smaller type like a caveat, whispered during a handshake, amendment executed by military liaison per Directive 8/1953. The margins were clean. No stray pen, no coffee ring. Just the sense of a temperature kept a degree too cold for comfort. The paper lie of sterility. The report pages beneath were thin as onion skin. Each line stamped through faintly onto the next. Paragraph headers read like metronomes. Hour 1, Hour 6, Hour 12, and then Day 2, Day 3. The language stayed measured. Blood pressures and respiratory rates. Subject effect elevated. Speech pressured. Appetite sustained. A note in the margin, initialed HW, adjusted a flow setting by a fraction. A precise hand that did not shake. Later, under Day 3, the tone clipped shorter. Participant C reports external whispering. Source undetermined. Mic gain increased. No external origin detected. Another hand added in pencil the way a junior signs in the wake of a senior. Gain verified. The next page carried a photograph paper-clipped to its top. A man seated on the painted floor, elbows on knees, eyes up toward the gridded vent. The caption read, only C at 53H. No name. No claim of ownership to the face. Just a number balanced on a blade of hours. At the back of the folder, a memo waited under carbon paper ghosts, headed Operational Summary for internal review. The salutation was to a colonel whose file jacket is probably dust by now. The closing line, short as a verdict, bled faintly through the paper below. Termination recommended. The date stamp that followed was the kind that clicks and inks and comes down flat as a gavel. Nov 7, 1953. And under it, one more stamp. A quieter one. Restricted. Hold. Then nothing. Only the cotton tape lying like a small pale snake beside the open box. And the reading room. Breathing its even. Mechanical. After midnight air. In the shadowed years after the Second World War. When victory parades had faded into routine. And the hum of peacetime industry was threaded with the hum of Cold War tension. The United States began looking inward, not toward its cities or farmlands, but into the private chambers of the mind. intelligence agencies, and military departments, stirred by whispers of Soviet breakthroughs in psychological endurance, authorized programs whose very titles were meant never to see daylight. Operation Hypnos was one of them. The proposal was born not in a university or think tank, but in a secure wing of a defense research bureau, 3 floors underground. Its stated aim, in language that balanced clinical detachment with military urgency, was to explore the boundaries of human consciousness under controlled wakefulness. In other words, to find out how long a person could be kept awake, how the mind would behave when the refuge of sleep was denied, and whether, in that liminal state, something hidden might surface, truths, confessions, even a heightened form of awareness beyond normal cognition. The Cold War had a way of making the improbable worth funding, and so the budget was signed, the room was built, and the search for a lead scientist began. The man who accepted the role was Dr. Harold E. Whitman, a neurologist with a reputation for brilliance, and for crossing ethical lines with the same precision he used to draw blood from a vein. He had served as a consultant during the war, studying pilot fatigue and battlefield stress, and had once proposed that sleep deprivation, applied strategically, might unmask deeper layers of the psyche. Whitman had the language of academia, the confidence of a surgeon, and the unnerving calm of a man for whom subjects were data first and humans second. Recruited under the cloak of national necessity, he assembled a hand-picked team of physicians, engineers, and behavioral scientists. Each signed a secrecy agreement. Each swore before a military liaison to treat the work as a matter of national security. To the outside world, their project didn't exist. And to those inside, the rules were simple. Observe everything, record everything, and ask no questions that did not serve the experiment. In the sparse project notes, Whitman's name appears not in the margins, but at the center of every major decision, always in firm black ink, never hesitant, never amended, as if he had already rehearsed the script before it was written. The rationale behind Operation Hypnos was built on fragments of wartime research, field reports from bomber crews who had flown missions for days without rest, Soviet medical papers translated in hurried offices, and a handful of classified experiments conducted on prisoners of war. Sleep, Whitman believed, was not merely a biological necessity, but a gatekeeper, a border patrol between waking reason and the more primitive mechanisms of the brain. Remove it, and the pathways between thought and impulse, between reality and imagination, would open wide. The military saw value in this. The intelligence branches dreamed of interrogations where subjects, too fatigued to guard their secrets, would surrender them without coercion, and perhaps, with the right conditioning, an enemy operative could be reshaped entirely. In the language of the 1953 memorandum, psychological adaptability may be enhanced through sustained wakefulness under environmental and pharmacological modulation. What it did not say outright, but what was clear to those in the room, was that the experiment would not stop at mere observation. It would push and push hard until the mind itself began to fray. Whitman's design called for absolute environmental control. The test chamber would be sealed, pressure balanced, and fed by a closed-loop ventilation system capable of delivering a precise mixture of oxygen and stimulant vapor. The stimulant, a proprietary compound synthesized in a defense laboratory, was classified above top secret, its formula known only to two chemists on the project and the military liaison. Cameras would record every inch of the chamber. Microphones embedded in the walls would catch even a breath drawn too sharply. A bank of monitors in the observation room would display heart rate, blood pressure, brainwave patterns, and a constantly updated wakefulness index calculated from pupil response and reaction time tests administered at intervals. The team would work in shifts, ensuring that someone was always watching, always logging, always ready to adjust the gas mixture or environmental factors to prolong the subject's wakefulness. No interruptions, Whitman insisted in one briefing. No breaks in the chain of observation. We are not merely studying them. We are keeping them on this side of the threshold. His voice was steady, but his eyes, according to one technician's later testimony, had the gleam of a man who wanted to see what would happen when the threshold finally broke. Recruitment of the test subjects was handled quietly, without public notice or institutional review. The pool was drawn from three sources: recently discharged veterans with no close family ties, civilian drifters who could be convinced with cash, and federal prison inmates willing to exchange participation for commuted sentences. On paper, they were volunteers, though the nature of the project was never fully disclosed to them. They were told they would be part of a resilience study to aid national defense, that they would be monitored for several weeks, and that their endurance would help improve survival for soldiers in extreme conditions. What they were not told was that they would be denied the possibility of sleep entirely, nor that the stimulant gas had never been tested long-term on humans. Each signed the consent form. Each was assigned a code letter, a through E, and each was photographed against the same pale wall, holding a placard with their code and the date. In these early photos, there is still light in their eyes, some with defiance, some with curiosity, none aware that they were stepping into a place from which, for some, there would be no return. They arrived one by one, not as a group, and not on the same day. A did not know B was coming. B had never heard of C. They were drawn in like separate threads, later to be woven into a single tense pattern. The first to arrive was Subject a man in his early 30s, lean from years of military service. His records hinted at valor, but also at disciplinary incidents, minor insubordination, a tendency toward questioning orders. His discharge had left him restless, his savings dwindling. And so when the offer came, a sealed envelope slid across a diner counter by a man in a gray suit. He didn't ask too many questions. In the intake photo, his eyes are steady, his jaw set, but the corner of his mouth seems to ask if the camera operator is worth trusting. The tag on his chest reads A 92753. His file notes describe him as self-reliant, adaptable, possibly resistant to suggestion, qualities Dr. Whitman was eager to test. Subject B was a contrast, mid-20s, slight in build, a face that could pass unnoticed in any crowd. His background was civilian, no military record, a string of temporary jobs in factories and shipping yards, and long gaps where no employer claimed him. The offer for B came through a recruiter in the city's underbelly, a place where debts changed hands over drinks and favors were paid in introductions. He agreed for the money, half up front, half on completion, and never read past the first paragraph of the agreement. In his photograph, his gaze is averted just enough to suggest the room interested him more than the lens. He wears a shirt with one loose button at the collar, his hair unkempt as though the camera had surprised him. His file mentions passive compliance, possible underlying anxiety, low threshold for stress, qualities the team logged as desirable for variation in subject profile. Subject C was the one the technicians remembered most vividly, not because of any loudness or resistance, but because of the way he observed everything. He was in his early 40s, with the weathered hands of a man who had worked outside most of his life. He had no surviving family, a drifter by choice, taking seasonal work in fields, at docks, on road crews. He signed the consent form slowly, as though reading each word was a form of weighing the people around him. In his intake photo, his expression is neutral, but his eyes, half shadowed under the brim of a borrowed cap, give the impression he is listening to something no one else can hear. His file is the briefest, but in Whitman's own handwriting, one note is underlined twice. Possible high perceptual sensitivity. Subject D came through the federal prison system. Late 20s, serving time for armed robbery. His prison file described him as volatile, capable of sudden aggression, but also as highly adaptive under pressure when given incentive. He had been offered an early release in exchange for participation, and he accepted with what one guard described as the grin of a man who thinks he's gaming the system. In his photograph, the grin is still there, though it does not quite reach his eyes. His build is heavy. His knuckles bear the scars of past fights, and his stance in the image suggests he sees this less as science and more as a contest. Whitman's notes beside his file remark, potential for dominance in group dynamic, worth monitoring. Subject E was the youngest, just 19. His background was rural, a farmhand's life marked by early mornings and long days. He had never been more than 100 miles from home until now. His recruitment came via a local sheriff who owed a favor to someone in the Defense Bureau. The boy had no record, no debts, and no reason to suspect anything beyond what he had been told. In his intake photo, his youth is apparent. Clear eyes, a trace of sunburn on his cheeks, His tag reads E10253. Whitman wrote little about him beyond baseline innocence. Observe for rate of degradation. The line was clinical, detached, as though degradation were a measurable and inevitable outcome. The five of them never met outside the chamber. Each was escorted separately into a windowless waiting area, given plain gray clothing, and led through a narrow hallway to the sealed room. The door was heavy, rubber sealed, and once it closed, it did so with the slow, final sound of pressure settling. Inside, the air was neutral, the lighting steady, and the walls so featureless they might have been painted from memory rather than observation. Each subject was assigned a cot, a small table, and a stool. The cots were evenly spaced along the walls, the tables bolted down. Cameras in each corner captured overlapping views, and above the room, out of reach, vents drew a constant low hiss into the air. The sound was easy to forget at first, the way a refrigerator hum disappears after minutes, but it was always there, like a second presence. In the observation room, Whitman stood before the one-way glass as the last subject settled in. His hands rested lightly on the rail, his expression unreadable. Around him, the team monitored instruments, baseline readings for heart rate, respiration, pupil dilation. All subjects were alert, their voices carrying faintly through the overhead speakers. For now, they spoke cautiously, introducing themselves by first name only, glancing around the room as if mapping the terrain. Whitman's gaze lingered on each in turn, as though already imagining the pages of the final report. On the control console, a hand reached for the valve, and with the gentlest twist, the stimulant gas began to flow, unseen, odorless, curling invisibly through the vents until it touched every breath the five of them would take. The gas entered without ceremony, no hiss loud enough to announce itself, no change in color, no scent to betray its presence. It was designed that way. The chemists had made certain of it. Molecules engineered to slip past the guard of the senses and settle deep in the lungs. The delivery system, a network of concealed pipes branching behind the chamber walls, fed into vents masked by wire mesh, evenly spaced, ensuring the flow reached every corner of the room. Above the observation glass, a gauge needle began its slow climb into the green, its numbers meaningless to anyone outside the project. But to the technicians, it marked the beginning of hour zero. At first, nothing changed. The five subjects continued their cautious small talk, voices bouncing lightly off the smooth walls. D ran a hand over his cot, testing the texture of the thin blanket. E tapped his fingers on the table, a soft rhythm that drew a sidelong glance from B. Whitman stood behind the glass, his reflection faint but steady, a shadow over the room. He didn't speak, didn't move except to note the time in his ledger. Beside him, a medical officer checked the first set of readings, respiratory rates holding steady, oxygen saturation unchanged, everything as expected. The gas would take time. It wasn't meant to jolt them awake. but to make wakefulness the only state they could reach. By hour 2, a subtle shift began. B's eyes seemed clearer, more alert, as if someone had turned up the sharpness on the world around him. He leaned forward on his stool, elbows on knees, speaking faster now. His sentences didn't wander, but there was an energy to them that hadn't been there before. C sat back, gaze drifting toward the ceiling vents, watching them without any obvious reason. The hiss, soft and constant, had faded into the background, but in the observation room, Whitman's eyes flicked toward the sound meters, noting how even ambient noise could shape the environment. Continuous audio stimuli, he murmured, not to anyone in particular, as though speaking to the room itself. The chamber's lighting was set to mimic late afternoon, a deliberate choice to confuse the body's sense of time. The ceiling fixtures cast a diffuse glow without shadows sharp enough to anchor the eye. No windows, no clocks, no markers to divide 1 hour from the next. The cots were not for sleeping. They knew that, even without being told. The blankets were thin, the pillows flat. A camera watched each cot from above, its lens glinting when it caught the light. The subjects were aware of them, at least in the beginning. The occasional glance upward, the reflexive adjustment of posture. These signs always faded, Whitman knew. After a few hours, people forgot the lenses, and that was when the truest behavior began to surface. By hour 6, the stimulant's first measurable effects were clear. Heart rates had risen by a few beats per minute across all subjects. Reaction time tests, administered through a series of buttons and lights fixed to the wall, came back faster. But the voices in the room had begun to shift. Words came more easily, but so did interruptions. Conversations overlapped, a restlessness creeping into the way they addressed each other. D laughed at something A said, though it wasn't particularly funny. B began pacing the narrow strip of floor between his cot and table. Whitman's pen scratched over the logbook. Small notes, precise, dated to the minute. Increase in motor activity, mild disinhibition, elevated verbal output. The temperature in the chamber held steady at a few degrees cooler than comfortable. Another calculated choice. Cooler air required the body to expend just enough energy to maintain warmth. Never enough to shiver, but enough to work against fatigue. The subjects didn't comment on it yet, but some crossed their arms loosely. Others rubbed their hands without seeming to notice. Every variable in the chamber served a purpose, and the gas was only one part of the larger design. By the end of the first day, their circadian rhythms would already be slipping, untethered from the natural cues that anchor waking and sleeping to the passage of time. Whitman called for a minor adjustment at hour 8. The stimulant concentration increased by a fraction, imperceptible to the subjects, but enough to nudge their neural activity further from the edge of drowsiness. The lead technician made the change with a turn of a marked dial, the new flow rate settling in under the hum of the ventilation. Through the glass, Whitman watched A and C in quiet conversation, their words indistinct through the speakers, but their faces lit with an intensity out of proportion to the exchange. In the far corner, E sat cross-legged on his cot, eyes unfocused, mouth moving slightly, as though repeating something to himself. In the notes from that first night, Whitman would later write, "Subject behavior remains within tolerance. No signs of distress beyond mild restlessness. Eyes brighter, speech fluid, motor activity sustained. But beneath the measured tone, there is the sense of a man who was waiting, watching for the first cracks to appear, because they always appeared, given time and gas and a room that offered no way out. The first night in the chamber was not marked by darkness, because darkness never came. The lighting, steady and unwavering, remained at that muted late afternoon glow, the kind that tricks the mind into thinking there is still more day to come. No lamps to dim, no switch to flip, just the same gentle illumination, casting the same soft shadows hour after hour. The air, too, was unchanging, cool enough to feel on the skin, just dry enough to keep their lips from settling into comfort. It was the kind of environment that asked nothing of them, and yet demanded everything. For a while, the five men talked as strangers do when thrown into the same waiting room. Surface-level things, where they were from, the kind of work they had done, small slices of themselves offered without detail. But as the hours passed, the pacing of speech shifted. Pauses became longer. Laughter came a little sharper, as if each man was beginning to feel the faint itch of something wrong, even if they couldn't yet name it. Whitman stood in the observation room, arms folded loosely behind his back. His eyes moved from subject to subject, watching for micro-expressions, the twitch of a hand, the tilt of a head, the length of a blink. The gas was doing its work. He could see it in the brighter eyes, the way they held themselves a little more upright despite the absence of sleep. Behind him, the medical officer read aloud the latest vitals. BP stable, HR elevated by 3, no anomalies in EEG. The EEG traces, however, told their own subtle story. Brain waves holding in the beta range longer than natural, moments when they might have dipped toward alpha abruptly flattening out, as if the stimulant vapor caught them just before they could step through the first door into drowsiness. Whitman made a note. Sleep onset successfully interrupted at micro-threshold. By hour 14, the room had begun to feel smaller, not because the dimensions had changed, but because each man's movements had begun to map themselves over the others. A pace the perimeter, always clockwise. B remained seated but tapped his foot in a constant, steady beat. D stretched his arms every few minutes, his eyes flicking toward anyone who moved too close. E fidgeted with the blanket on his cot, folding and refolding the edges as if creating perfect corners might anchor him. C sat mostly still, gaze following the vent above him as though the faint hiss carried some private meaning. Conversations rose and fell, interrupted by moments of quiet that felt heavier than the words that had come before them. It was during one of those silences that the first test was administered. A set of wall-mounted lights blinked in sequence, prompting the subjects to press a corresponding button on the console beside their tables. The task was simple, the pattern clear, but the real measurement lay in their reaction time and the subtle hesitations between cues. Whitman's eyes narrowed slightly as the results came in. Reaction times were not slowing, as they would in natural wakefulness approaching midnight. They were holding, even sharpening. The stimulant was maintaining cognitive speed, but the way they glanced at each other between sequences suggested a shared awareness of being tested and of failing to know why. Hour 17 brought the first signs of mild irritability. Not overt, not yet, but there in the sharpness of a reply, in the way B sighed when A circled past him for the 20th time, or in how D watched E's constant folding with a look that wasn't quite a smile. The gas was keeping their bodies alert, but their patience was thinning. Whitman marked the shift with quiet satisfaction. Tension in a closed environment was an expected and desired variable. The guards in the corridor remained at their post, silent and motionless, only their occasional shift of weight betraying that they were listening to. The hours stretched into something uncountable. No one asked for the time, perhaps because some instinct told them it would not be given, or perhaps because they already understood that time here was not measured by clocks, but by the weight of wakefulness pressing gently against their thoughts. The first yawn came from E, small, almost swallowed, and Whitman's gaze caught it instantly. He didn't need to speak. One of the technicians reached for the dial, increasing the gas concentration by the smallest fraction. In the chamber, the hiss of the vents did not grow louder, but in the next 5 minutes, the young man's eyes seemed clearer again. The drowsiness pushed back like a tide. By the time hour 20 arrived, the silence in the room had grown heavier. Each man had settled into his own small orbit, interacting less, conserving words, perhaps sensing that every conversation was being listened to, logged, and dissected behind the glass. The hiss continued, steady and unbroken. The lighting had not dimmed for a single moment, and though none of them had attempted to lie down for more than a minute or two, the cots remained untouched by real rest. Whitman closed his notebook for the night, not because the work was done, but because the experiment had crossed its first threshold. The subjects had passed through the first sleepless night, and as he turned away from the glass, he knew the real unraveling was only just beginning. The second day began without announcement, because in the chamber, days did not truly begin, nor did they end. The same soft, unyielding light still filled every corner, no brighter, no dimmer. The air still carried that faint, unbroken hiss from the vents above. The walls remained smooth, pale, and without any mark to suggest the passage of time. For the 5 men inside, the only sign that hours had passed was the dull weight in their bodies, and even that was being held back, suspended, by the invisible stimulant drifting constantly through their lungs. No one had slept, not truly. Some had closed their eyes for minutes, maybe seconds, but the moment drowsiness reached them, it slipped away like a hand pulled from their grasp. They were beginning to notice, and though no one said it aloud, the understanding seemed to sit between them like an unspoken truth. A was the first to show change that morning. or whatever morning meant here. He moved differently now, faster in his pacing, his eyes less focused on the floor and more on the others, as though scanning for something they had yet to reveal. B sat with his back against the wall, knees drawn up, speaking quietly to himself under his breath, not in distress, but with the rhythm of someone counting or reciting something from memory. C remained in his corner, watching, always watching, his gaze slow and deliberate, like a man who had accepted that observation was his only form of control. D grew restless, stretching and flexing his hands as if readying for work that would never come. And E, the youngest, seemed caught between nervous energy and the beginnings of something heavier. He smiled when spoken to, but the smile ended at his lips, never reaching his eyes. By what might have been midday outside, the pacing had spread. A was still moving in his clockwise path, but now D had begun walking the opposite direction, crossing him at sharp, almost confrontational angles. No words were exchanged in those moments, but each pass seemed to leave a faint mark on the air, a small tightening of the shoulders, a longer stare. Whitman made another note: territorial emergence, indirect confrontation. B had stopped counting aloud, but now tapped his fingers rapidly on the edge of his table. Faster and faster until C finally glanced over, not with irritation, but with the faintest smirk, as though he had been waiting for someone to notice. The second test was introduced without warning. A speaker in the chamber played a slow, irregular tone, each subject instructed to press a button the instant they heard it. The pattern was intentionally unpredictable, sometimes seconds apart, sometimes stretching into long, uneasy gaps. Reaction times remained sharp, but there was a shift in posture afterward, a new tension in the shoulders. The sound was low enough to seem almost inside the ear, impossible to ignore. The test ended after 20 minutes, but the silence that followed did not feel like relief. It felt like waiting for the tone to return. Hour 30 brought the first subtle signs of conflict. B asked E, quietly, almost politely, to stop folding and unfolding the blanket. E didn't respond, not because he hadn't heard, but because he seemed lost in the perfection of the creases. A few minutes later, D muttered something under his breath as A crossed him again in the pacing path. Words too low for the microphones to catch clearly, but Whitman could read the tightening in A's jaw. In the notes, he wrote only, "Microaggressions beginning." The second day was where the true work began. Not the tests, not the vital signs, but the shaping of the environment into a place where each man's mind would start to turn against itself. By hour 34, their movements had grown less purposeful. More sitting, more staring. The gas was keeping them awake, yes, but it could not force activity beyond what their minds chose. The technicians debated increasing the stimulant concentration again. Whitman declined. It was not yet time. He wanted to see how long they could endure at this level before the cracks widened on their own. The lighting remained unchanged, the temperature constant. Every variable held steady so that any shift could be traced not to the room, but to them. And then, just before hour 36, C spoke for the first time in nearly an hour. His voice was calm, even curious. "Do you think they're watching us right now?" No one answered immediately. B glanced at the camera in the corner. A stopped pacing for the first time since morning, and E's hands froze over his blanket. D only smiled, but it was not the kind of smile meant for comfort. The question hung there, unanswered, and yet it seemed that after it was asked, everyone moved just a little differently, glancing at the corners, at the vents, at the walls that had no windows and no doors but the one they had come through. Whitman leaned slightly closer to the glass. The real test had begun. The air in the chamber felt heavier now, not in temperature, not in scent, but in the way it seemed to cling to the skin. Every breath was the same measured draw of stimulant-laced oxygen, every exhale a faint mist in the cool air. The lighting had not shifted a single degree, that same muted afternoon hue pressing against their eyes, robbing them of the cues the body craves, hues that say, "Rest now." But there was no rest, not here. And as the hours stretched further into the second day, though no one could count them accurately, the closeness between the 5 men began to warp. The easy surface-level conversations of the first hours had thinned into short exchanges, the kind that ended before anyone could decide whether they wanted to continue them. Had stopped pacing in his perfect clockwise loop. Now his path was jagged, cutting across the room without pattern. His eyes darted more, not frantically, but searching, as if expecting to catch someone in the act of doing something unseen. B still sat against the wall, but his tapping had grown louder, more deliberate. His gaze wandered between the others, but lingered most often on the cameras. C remained calm, unnervingly so, perched on the edge of his cot with his hands folded loosely in his lap, watching every small interaction as though cataloging them in his mind. D's restlessness had sharpened into something tighter, his stretches and flexes now accompanied by glances toward A whenever their paths neared. And E, the folding of the blanket had ceased, replaced by running his fingers repeatedly along the seam of the cot, over and over. The same motion, the same spot. In the observation room, Whitman leaned against the console, his notes precise, almost clinical, but there was a faint curl of interest in his mouth. This was the stage where the stimulant's stability began to bend under the pressure of fatigue. Not enough to send them into collapse, but enough to loosen the threads that kept their interactions civil. One of the technicians adjusted the audio feed, isolating the sound of the men's breathing. The patterns were uneven now, shorter draws from A, slower, deeper ones from C. Tiny pauses in E's as though he sometimes forgot to take the next breath until his body forced him to. Whitman listened without comment, letting the room tell him its own story. The first real spark came at what must have been somewhere beyond hour 40. B told A to stop crossing so close to him. His tone was low, almost controlled, but there was an edge to it, like a knife hidden under cloth. A paused mid-step, looking down at him without speaking. The silence stretched for several seconds before A turned away, pacing again, only this time veering even closer to B than before. C's lips curved into the faintest, knowing smile. D shifted his weight toward the interaction, his eyes narrowing slightly. E kept tracing the seam, as though the moment didn't exist. But it did, and Whitman knew it had just planted itself in all of their minds. From that point on, the smallest actions began to carry weight. A cough from D when B was speaking, a long look from C when E stood up. Even the way someone set down a tin cup made another's head snap up. They were not yet hostile, but the shared sense of being observed, manipulated, was starting to curl inward, turning them toward each other not as companions, but as potential threats. Whitman made a note. Paranoia emergence. Mild. The gas flow remained unchanged. The technicians monitored the stimulant levels with the same detached precision, but in the chamber time had become something thick, viscous. Each hour pulled at the mind a little differently. They could not see the outside world, but they could feel the absence of it. No sunrise, no sunset, just the same steady hum of ventilation and the knowledge that there was no way to measure how much longer this would last. By hour 44, words were fewer, glances were longer, and movement had slowed, as though each man was waiting for someone else to make the next move. Whitman called for another test, this one a memory recall. A voice through the speaker recited a short sequence of numbers and words. Each subject was to repeat them exactly after a 10-second delay. The results were mixed. Reaction time remained high, but accuracy was beginning to fray. Not enough to be alarming, but enough to show that beneath the surface alertness, the brain was beginning to fight itself. The moment that defined the day came without warning. D reached for the water dispenser, and A stepped in at the same time. Their hands brushed, nothing more, but D pulled back sharply, muttering something low. A replied just as softly, but with a tone that carried through the microphones. The words themselves were not aggressive, but the weight in them was. The others turned to look. No one intervened, and no one laughed. The moment passed, but the air after it felt changed. Heavier. Whitman closed his notebook for the hour. Satisfied. The fractures had appeared, small now, but inevitable. And once they began, they never truly healed in places like this. The room had not grown darker, and yet it felt as if the light no longer reached all the corners. The same steady, muted afternoon glow still filled the chamber, but something about it seemed different now, flatter, heavier. The air hissed softly from the vents above, unchanged in sound or rhythm, but to the 5 men inside, it felt thicker, as though each breath carried something unseen beyond the stimulant. Conversations had become rare, and when words were spoken, they were softer, not from fatigue, but from a strange reluctance, as if every voice carried the risk of being heard by something or someone other than the men in the room. I had stopped wandering entirely now. Instead, sitting at the edge of his cot with his elbows on his knees, head lowered, eyes shifting toward the others only when they moved. B still sat in his corner, knees drawn up, murmuring again under his breath. The words too quiet to be caught even by the chamber microphones. C watched him with a faint, unsettling patience. D lay back, staring up at the ceiling, his jaw working slowly as though grinding an invisible thread between his teeth. And he had stopped tracing the seam of the cot, his fingers now resting perfectly still on his lap, but his gaze fixed unblinking on the far wall. Whitman stood closer to the glass than before, hands clasped loosely behind his back. His eyes flicked from one man to the next, the quiet hum of the monitoring equipment behind him, the only sound in the observation room. Gas concentration holding at target, the technician to his right confirmed. Whitman only nodded. He didn't need to hear the numbers. He could see the results in their bodies. The stimulant was still working, keeping them awake. But now, wakefulness was something raw, stripped of its usual balance. The brain was alert, but the mind was beginning to turn on itself. Behind the glass, B's murmuring stopped suddenly. He looked up, not at anyone in particular, just up, his eyes darting toward the vent. Whitman made a note, auditory attention to inanimate source. It wasn't the first time one of them had glanced at the vent for too long, but it was the first time he had seen that particular tightness in the expression, the look of someone listening for something they weren't sure they should hear. The first whisper came less than an hour later, caught faintly in the microphone feed, soft enough that the technicians almost dismissed it as interference. But when they isolated the audio, the shape of it was clear. It was B's voice, speaking words that did not match any known phrase. Slow, deliberate, with pauses between them. In the chamber, C shifted slightly on his cot, his eyes narrowing toward B. The others didn't react outwardly, but their postures changed in those small, almost imperceptible ways that suggested they too had heard, or thought they had. Whitman leaned in. The gas was not meant to cause hallucinations. Its formula was clean, refined. But the human brain, denied rest long enough, began to make its own. From then on, the atmosphere in the chamber seemed to tilt further. Glances were quicker, sharper, and each man seemed to guard his movements as though revealing too much might be dangerous. D, who had been restless from the beginning, began to speak more. Short sentences at first, then longer ones, not to anyone in particular. Sometimes about things in the room, sometimes about things no one else could see. "There's a shadow in the corner," he said once, in a tone so casual it might have been mistaken for a joke. But he did not smile, and no one asked what he meant. E's stillness was perhaps the most unsettling. He had not spoken in hours, but his eyes now moved constantly, tracking things unseen. His breathing was steady, too steady. Whitman could feel the shift, not just in them, but in the room itself. The soundscape had changed, the steady rhythm of movement replaced by longer silences, broken only by the scrape of a chair leg or the sudden shift of a cot. He instructed the technician to run another cognitive test, this time a word association sequence. The speaker in the chamber gave a word. Each subject had to respond with the first word they thought of. It began normally enough. Tree, leaf, water, river. words began to stray. Shadow, watcher, door, locked. Whitman's pen paused after that last one. The gas was working perfectly, but the mind's descent was beginning to accelerate, and the whispers, they were multiplying. By what might have been hour 50, the whispers were no longer confined to one man. The microphones picked up low voices from two, sometimes three at once, overlapping, never in unison. The technicians recorded every syllable, most of which made no coherent sense. But a few words, just a few, surfaced again and again. Open. Below. Don't sleep. Whitman reviewed the playback twice before setting it aside. The meaning was not his concern, only the effect. And the effect, he knew, was exactly what he had been waiting for. The air in the chamber seemed to hum now, not from any machine, not from the vents, but from within the minds of the men themselves. That same pale, unwavering light pressed into their eyes without mercy, flattening shadows, denying them the comfort of depth. Yet somehow, the corners of the room felt darker than before, the edges softer, as if the room were quietly folding in on itself. The hiss from the vents remained constant, steady, but it carried a weight that made each inhale feel longer, slower. The stimulant still worked, holding them upright in wakefulness, but their movements had shifted from restless to calculated, deliberate. The pacing was gone, replaced by small, controlled actions. A cup lifted, set down, a glance traded and held for a fraction too long. They were conserving something now, not energy, but control. Control over the fraying line between thought and impulse. Sat against the far wall, one knee raised, staring at the floor as though the concrete might give him answers. B's murmuring had returned, but now it rose and fell in rhythm, almost like prayer. C sat perfectly still on his cot, his eyes half-lidded but alert beneath. D leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on E, who still had not spoken in what might have been hours. E's head was tilted slightly, his lips parted, as though listening for something deep within the walls. Whitman stood close to the glass, his reflection barely visible in the observation window. He could see it, how the tension had condensed, how the air between the subjects now felt like a wire stretched too tightly. In the corner of the observation room, the microphone feed crackled faintly. Not interference, but the layered, low voices of at least 3 subjects speaking at once. He motioned for the technician to isolate the channels. The words were indistinct, blurred, but one phrase emerged more than once. "Don't close your eyes." Whitman tapped his pen against his notebook, making no comment. He didn't need to ask why the phrase repeated. He knew exactly why it was there, and what it meant for the experiment. The stimulant kept them from sleeping, but it could not prevent the body's need from pressing harder. And in that press, the mind began to hear and see things that would not exist otherwise. The first real fracture came without warning. B's murmuring stopped abruptly, and he lifted his head, fixing his eyes on D with a sharpness that cut the silence in two. "You're too close," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. Dee did not move at first, only blinked once, slowly, then leaned forward slightly more. "No, I'm not," he replied, his tone flat. The air between them thickened instantly. I looked up from the floor, eyes shifting from one to the other. C's lips curved just faintly, as if waiting for the next move. He didn't look away from the wall, but his fingers twitched once, then stilled. Whitman's pen hovered above the page. His notes in this stage were always shorter, because this was where the subjects began writing the rest of the story themselves. The chamber microphone caught every breath, the subtle shifting of bodies, the tightening of fabric as muscles flexed beneath. When Dee finally leaned back, the moment dissolved, but it left a mark, not on the skin, but somewhere deeper. It was the kind of moment that didn't go away, the kind that replayed in silence, growing sharper each time. The others felt it too, because now every movement seemed heavier. Every sound meant something. A sip of water was not just a sip, it was a signal. A step forward was not just movement, it was intent. Whitman had seen it before, this stage where paranoia was no longer creeping. It had arrived, and it would not leave. By hour 54, though no one in the chamber could truly measure it, their coordination had begun to fray in subtle ways. They still followed instructions when given, but the pauses before compliance were longer. The latest reaction time test showed the slowest results yet. Not from fatigue, but from hesitation, as though each man weighed the act itself against some unseen cost. In the room, silence now ruled. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that waits for something to happen, that listens for it, that leans toward it. Whitman stood back from the glass, his expression unreadable. He knew what was next, and it would not be long now. The tension that had been building for hours finally found its release, not in a sudden explosion, but in a slow, almost inevitable slide towards something sharp and irreversible. The chamber still looked the same. 4 concrete walls, the same muted light, the same metallic scent carried by the ventilation system. But to the 5 men inside, the room no longer felt neutral. It felt like a cage. Every glance had weight. Every pause in movement was a provocation. A sat on the edge of his cot, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were pale. B's murmuring had grown faster, his words now spilling over each other without space for breath. C leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed, but his attention was fixed on the room in a way that felt almost predatory. D paced again, but now in short, agitated bursts, and E's lips had begun to move silently, his eyes tracking invisible shapes along the far wall. It began with a sound so small, it might have gone unnoticed. The metallic clink of the water dispenser lever snapping back. D had just filled his cup when B's voice cut through the chamber, sharp, deliberate. "Don't touch that again." The words froze D in place for a fraction of a second before he turned. in hand. "Why?" he asked. His tone was calm, but the edge beneath it was clear. B didn't answer immediately, only stared, unblinking. Then, "You've had enough." D laughed once, short and dry. "We all get the same," he said, but the cup in his hand didn't move toward his lips. I shifted on his cot, his eyes flicking between them. C didn't move, but his head tilted slightly, and E, still staring at the wall, let out a single low chuckle that didn't match anything around him. The silence that followed was worse than the words. D's cup finally rose, slow and deliberate, and he drank. B stood, not quickly, but with the kind of precision that made every muscle movement visible. His footsteps toward D were measured, one, then another, the sound of rubber soles against the concrete floor sharp in the microphone feed. "Put it down," he said again, and though his voice was quiet, it carried the kind of certainty that made it feel less like a request and more like an order. D didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes locked on B's. Whitman leaned forward at the observation glass, his pen frozen above his notebook. The technician to his left muted the background feed, letting the sound of the two men breathing fill the speakers. Then it happened. Not a blow, not a scream, but a sudden, violent motion as D shoved the empty cup against B's chest. The sound of plastic hitting fabric was small, but the reaction wasn't. B's hand shot up, grabbing D by the front of his shirt and pulling him forward. A stood instantly, moving 2 steps toward them before freezing. C remained seated, but his gaze sharpened, and E's laughter returned, low, strange, and without rhythm. The scuffle lasted only seconds before they broke apart, neither man falling, neither man shouting. But the air after it was different, thicker, charged. The outburst wasn't in the shove itself. It was in the unspoken truth that followed, the awareness that physical boundaries were now open to be crossed. Whitman stepped back from the glass, his expression unreadable. "Mark this," he said to the technician, who logged the time and the details without looking up. Whitman didn't need to replay the footage. He knew what it meant. This was the moment the experiment crossed from mental strain into the territory where survival instincts began to override cooperation. It was no longer about enduring. It was about control. And in that room, with no night, no day, no rest, control was a resource as scarce as sleep. The shove did not end anything. It organized everything. Lines that had been faint and shifting hardened into boundaries the eye could follow. B began to orbit the water dispenser and the nearest vent, claiming them without declaring it. D paced in short, staking strides that carved a wedge of floor he treated as his own. Positioned himself where both men were always in sight, posture alert, hands loose. A sentry without a post. C held to his corner with the gravity of a patient observer, a ledger without paper. And E drifted at the periphery, still and listening, as if the room itself were telling him where to stand. Words returned only in fragments. Enough. Move. Don't. Spoken softly but carrying the hard edges of intent. The hiss from not change. Yet everyone glanced up more often, as though the air might choose a side. On the glass, Whitman's pencil drew short bars and arrows, vectors of attention, proximity pressures, while the technician annotated timestamps and heart rate spikes. The chamber's light remained that same false afternoon, but its color felt thinner now, as if it passed through more than air to reach the floor. The second food cart arrived through the slot with its standard rations, and no one moved for a full 10 seconds. Then A stepped forward, separated portions with the practiced neutrality of a quartermaster, and placed them precisely on the bolted tables. B watched his hands rather than the food. D watched B. C watched the whole procession as if the room were writing its own report. And E ate slowly, as if chewing could keep the world from speaking too loudly. New patterns nested inside the old. Sleep was impossible, so ritual replaced it. A tapped his thumbnail 3 times against the table before he stood or sat. B counted breaths between sips and would not drink if the number was wrong. D stretched, rolled his shoulders, flexed each finger, then repeated. But now he did it facing the vent rather than the door. C matched his breathing to the hum of the ventilators and blinked on odd counts. E stopped looking at the seam of his cot and instead tracked invisible lines between the 4 upper corners of the room. When the memory test returned over the speaker, lists of short, simple nouns, responses jumped like a needle across a worn record. Window, none here. Door, locked. Bed, don't lie down. Accuracy decayed, but meaning condensed, as if the words themselves had learned the room. In the observation bay, the medical officer recommended a fractional increase in stimulant to counter rising microsleeps, those thin, eyelid-length collapses at the edges of attention. Whitman refused for the hour, preferring to measure what the mind invented to carry itself across the gap. The microphones captured whispers that did not belong to any single mouth. Layers of quiet speech braided into a sound like cloth being folded in the dark. When the channels were separated, 2 words recurred more than probability allowed. Open and watch. The first glanced toward the door. The second curved back upon the glass. The divide sharpened with a minor thing that became a major thing. A tin spoon placed at the wrong angle. B rotated it to align with the table's edge. D rotated it back across the line. No blows followed, but a kind of ownership settled over objects as if over land. A diffused the moment by sliding both spoons to the center, palms open. C said evenly, "We can mark places or mark time," and left the sentence there like a stone in a path. E, without raising his voice, said, "Don't mark the door." And everyone looked at the door, though no one had mentioned it. After that, B began to speak to the camera when no one else would answer him, not pleading, not accusing, only stating small facts in a measured tone. 5 present, food delivered, water taken, as if making a ledger entry for someone beyond the glass. D started answering those entries under his breath, not to agree, but to erase. Not yours. Mine now. A stepped between statement. understatement, with simple tasks: dividing, stacking, wiping crumbs into a neat pile that said control could still be made from fragments. C withheld comment until a pattern had repeated 3 times, then offered a line that cut the tangle. If you push the world, it pushes back. The wall is part of the world. And then watched to see which mind would test that theorem first. E whispered only 4 words the entire segment. Don't sleep at all. And the microphones caught every syllable as if the room itself had leaned in. Control from the outside narrowed as control inside thickened. The EEG pens traced stubborn beta, saw-toothed by microlapses that ended in knife-edge rises. Pupils held dilated under steady light, skins chilled by the constant cool. The liaison at the back of the observation room cleared his throat once. The bureaucratic gesture of a clock, asked for timeline confirmation, and received it in Whitman's even voice. On track. The technician suggested a 10-minute auditory reset, white noise wash to scrub the soundscape, only to have Whitman shake his head once. Not yet. The outburst had opened a door that no manual acknowledged. The divide was not an error. It was data. When the next ration cart slid in, A again served by measure, B adjusted, D resisted, C observed, E listened, and then a new element arrived uninvited. A soft knocking from the far vent, spaced like a code. 3. Pause. 2. Pause. 3. The microphones caught it. The metal vibrated under the skin of sound. B went very still. D faced the vent squarely. A looked to the camera as if to ask a question without words. C lifted his chin the length of a breath, and E smiled for the first time since the door had sealed, not with joy, but with recognition. It's awake, he said. And in the observation bay, several pens stopped moving at once. The divide had found its voice, and the room, which had been engineered to speak only through bodies and numbers, began, quietly, methodically, to answer back. The knocking did not repeat immediately, which made it worse, because in its absence, the memory of it grew sharper. Each man replayed the pattern differently in his mind. 3. Pause. 2. Pause. 3. But all agreed on one thing. It had been real. The vent in question was narrow, the metal a dull silver where dust hadn't settled. The airflow from it had always been steady, but now it felt cooler, slower, as if something on the other side was shaping the current. B moved first, stepping closer without taking his eyes off it. His head tilted slightly, listening. D shifted his weight forward, his arms loose at his sides, ready for motion. A stood between them, not to block, but to mediate the distance. C stayed seated, but his gaze sharpened into the kind of focus that made the air between him and the vent feel measured. And E's smile remained, faint and unwavering. His eyes half-lidded as though he already knew what would come next. Whitman leaned in toward the observation glass, his pen moving again, recording details that only someone who had lived inside this experiment's rhythm would think to note. Increased orientation to single source, cluster focus, non-verbal consensus forming. The technician beside him turned a dial to amplify the chamber's ambient feed. Static filled the speakers at first, the low hum of the ventilation system, the shuffling of bare feet against concrete. And then, faint but precise, the pattern returned. 3, pause, 2, pause, 3. B froze in place, lips slightly parted. D's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. A's head turned toward the camera as if to gauge whether anyone else had heard it. C blinked once, slow and deliberate, and E whispered just loudly enough for the microphones to catch. "It's not for you." The next knock came faster. 3, 2, 3, pause, 3, 1, 2. B leaned in closer, his ear almost against the vent. He mouthed numbers without speaking them, counting the spaces. D stepped nearer, but stopped short of standing beside him. A's eyes moved between the two of them like a referee who couldn't see the ball. C finally rose, moving to the far corner where he could see everyone at once. He didn't move at all, but began to hum, low, steady, almost in tune with the vent's vibration. The humming unsettled A, who glanced at him twice before turning back. In the observation bay, the audio technician started mapping the knocks onto a grid. "Could be code," he muttered. But Whitman didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on E, and that smile. When the pattern shifted again, B backed away a single step. "It stopped," he said quietly. But his hands twitched as though still feeling the vibration through the metal. D took his place at the vent, crouching slightly. He tapped the metal once with his knuckle. Soft, quick, a test. No answer came. Not immediately. The pause stretched so long it felt deliberate. Then, faintly, something tapped back. Not the same rhythm as before, but an exact imitation of D's single knock. The effect was instant. B's shoulders tensed. A moved closer to D. C's eyes narrowed, and E laughed. Not the low, broken sound from before, but a single, short laugh that held no warmth. "Now it knows you're here," he said. From that moment, the vent became more than a fixture. It became a player, a presence. The group's movements began to orient around it. Meals were eaten in sight of it. Arguments happened farther away from it. Even sleep-like stillness occurred with someone facing toward it. B and D began a silent competition to stand nearest without being challenged. A maintained his middle ground, but started glancing toward the vent as if waiting for instructions. C kept his corner, but tracked every interaction like a judge without a bench. And E's relationship with it was different. He spoke to it sometimes, in tones too soft for the microphones to catch. He tilted his head toward it, as though listening for something the others could not hear. Whitman noted all of it, but his pen slowed each time E spoke. The liaison in the back asked if the code should be broken, analyzed, traced, but Whitman said no. "It's the reaction we want," he murmured. not the origin. The technician logged that line, marking it with a double asterisk. By the end of that watch cycle, the knocking had returned 5 more times, each with slight variations in spacing. None of the men inside agreed on its meaning, but they all agreed it meant something, and in the sterile, unchanging light of the chamber, meaning was more dangerous than anything that could pass through the vents. It began so quietly that at first it didn't seem like an event at all. C was seated in his usual corner, legs drawn in loosely, back resting against the cold wall. He had been still for some time, his breathing matched to the steady hum of the vents. The others were scattered in their chosen zones, B standing close to the vent with his arms crossed, D pacing a short track near the center, A sitting at the bolted table stacking and unstacking the same 3 metal cups, and E leaning slightly toward the vent, lips moving in that same silent conversation he had been having for hours. The knock had not come yet this cycle, but its absence was its own presence now, an open space everyone was waiting for. When C finally shifted, it wasn't to stand, but to fold forward slowly, head resting against his knees. Whitman, behind the glass, glanced at the heart rate monitor feed. It was elevated, but not alarmingly so. The technician kept his eyes on the motion sensors, noting the slight sway in C's shoulders. Then the sway stopped, completely. The air seemed to change temperature, not in degrees, but in perception. Unnoticed first, his stacking paused mid-motion, one cup balanced atop another without sound. D stopped pacing. B's gaze flicked from the vent to C and back again. E's head turned, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "He's gone quiet," A said, his voice careful. But no one answered. The collapse came all at once. C's body tipped sideways as though some invisible weight had been removed from the inside. His hands twitched once, then opened fully. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. D was the first to move toward him, crouching and placing a hand on his shoulder. C didn't react. "C," D said. "Nothing." The use of his letter name felt strange now, more like a label than a call. B stepped closer, keeping one eye on the vent, as though expecting it to answer for what was happening. Arose from the table and approached slowly, as if afraid to disrupt something unseen. He didn't move from his position, but spoke in that low tone that carried just enough. "He's not sleeping. He's listening." The words struck something in the others. D's hand recoiled slightly. A's eyes flicked to E, searching for an explanation. B's jaw tightened. "Listening to what?" he asked, but his tone was flat, unwilling to invite an answer he didn't want. E smiled faintly. "The part you can't hear yet." The technician's fingers hesitated over the console switches. "Do we intervene?" he asked without looking up. Whitman didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on C, his pen tapping once against the clipboard. "Not yet," he finally said. "Let it run." Minutes stretched. The hum of the vents filled the space between shallow breaths. And then, without warning, the knock returned. Louder this time. 3. Pause. 2. Pause. 3. The effect was immediate. C's eyes opened, but they didn't look at anyone. Instead, they locked on the vent with a clarity that was almost physical. His lips parted, and he whispered something so faint it barely registered on the microphones. The audio tech isolated it, boosted the volume, and still, the only thing anyone could make out was a single word. Open. The others froze. The knocking stopped. E's smile widened a fraction, as though some confirmation had been given. D stepped back from C slowly. B's eyes moved from C to E and back again. A spoke first, quiet but firm. We don't touch it. The line was less an instruction and more a plea. But C didn't answer. He just kept staring at the vent, eyes wide, pupils dilated far beyond what the light should allow. His breathing steadied, and then he began to hum, low, matching the vent's tone almost perfectly. In the observation bay, Whitman's voice was level. Mark this as the first breach. He's aligned. No one asked what he meant. The hum from C did not fade. It deepened, blending into the air like a thread stitched into fabric. It was no longer just a sound. It was an anchor. B shifted his stance, arms uncrossing as if to free his hands for something inevitable. D resumed pacing, but now each turn was angled so he could keep both C and the vent in view. A hovered close, trying to place himself between everyone without appearing to. And E was utterly still, his gaze fixed on Whitman's glass. Not the vent, not the others, but the invisible eye that watched them. Whitman leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, the clipboard hanging loose. He had spent years behind observation glass, watching controlled chaos unfold, watching rules bend under the weight of human behavior. But this was different. The control wasn't bending. It was being replaced. The vent, whatever it was, had become the experiment's true center, and the human subjects were no longer acting toward the parameters, but toward it. The liaison at the back cleared his throat again, the bureaucratic signal for urgency. Colonel wants to know if containment's compromised, he said quietly. Whitman didn't look away from C. Containment's intact, he replied. Control is what's changing. The technician adjusted the gain, the chamber's hum now filling the observation bay. Every breath from C matched the vent's tone. The knock didn't return, but something new began. A faint scraping, metal on metal, deep inside the ductwork. It was irregular, like something shifting in place. The sound pulled D toward the vent, his steps almost unconscious. B intercepted, stepping into his path. You hear it? D asked, his voice low but urgent. B nodded once. Yeah, but it's not for you. The words echoed E's earlier phrase, and for a brief moment, D looked at him as though measuring whether that was true. tried to steer them away. "Back off, both of you." But C's humming cut through the space between them like a held note in a darkened room. The scraping stopped, and in its place came a rush of air, colder than before. He finally moved, walking toward C with a slow, deliberate pace. "You're too loud," he said softly, and the hum stopped mid-breath. C's head turned to E, but his eyes were still unfocused. He leaned in just enough to whisper something the microphones couldn't catch. And whatever it was, it made C smile for the first time in the experiment. The liaison stepped closer to Whitman. "Sir, we have enough data. This is outside protocol. Recommend termination." Whitman didn't answer immediately. His mind ran down both branches of the decision tree. Pull them out now. Contain whatever's inside that vent. Close the file forever. Or let it run. Find out what happens when control is no longer theirs. He looked at C, still smiling faintly. At B and D, locked in a silent standoff. At A, the last figure holding any sense of balance. And at E, who glanced back at the glass as if he knew exactly what Whitman was thinking. Finally, Whitman straightened. "We let it run." The room in the observation bay went still. The technician hesitated over the kill switch. The liaison's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Whitman's voice stayed calm, measured. "If we shut it down now, we never know what it was trying to do. If we keep going, maybe we find out." His eyes returned to the vent. "Mark this as phase 2. Inside the chamber, as if in response, the knocking returned. Slower this time. Deliberate. The knocking began with the precision of a clock. Each impact spaced evenly enough that it seemed mechanical. But the sound was too heavy, too deliberate, to be part of the ductwork's natural rhythm. 3. Pause. 2. Pause. 3. The same code as before, but slower. Drawn out like someone speaking each syllable to be sure it was understood. B stood closest, his ear angled toward the vent, but his body kept rigid, as if afraid to acknowledge it fully. D stayed a few feet back, his weight shifting with each knock, the pacing rhythm now replaced by the sound coming from the wall. A had stopped moving entirely, his gaze fixed on C. And C. C had begun to hum again, perfectly timed to the knocks, each note threading through the silence between them. E moved first, not toward the vent, but toward A. "You hear it differently, don't you?" he asked. His voice was low, not threatening, but the kind that carried an undercurrent of inevitability. A didn't respond, his jaw tightening instead. "It's not the same for everyone," E continued. "Some of us hear what it wants. Some hear what it needs." Whitman, in the observation bay, scribbled something in the margin of his notes but didn't look up. The liaison took a step closer to the glass. "Sir, this isn't data anymore. This is—" Whitman cut him off without raising his voice. "It's still data until it ends." The knocking stopped abruptly. For a moment, The silence felt heavier than the sound had. And then a new noise began, a low, drawn-out groan of metal under strain, like the vent was expanding from the inside. The cold rush of air intensified, carrying with it a faint scent, damp, metallic, unfamiliar. The scent made Dee flinch, his nose wrinkling. "Smells like rain," he muttered, but B shook his head. "That's not rain." The words seemed to carry more weight than they should. C's humming grew louder, not frantic, but insistent. He turned his head toward the others, still smiling faintly, and said a single sentence. "It's ready now." The microphones caught it perfectly. The technician glanced at Whitman, waiting for a cue. Whitman didn't give one. E walked past A, past D, until he was only inches from the vent. His hand hovered just short of touching the metal. The air from it pulsed, soft but deliberate, against his skin. B moved to block him, but E's other hand came up, palm open. "It's not yours," he said simply. The standoff held for 3 long seconds before the sound came again. This time not knocking, but a long, drawn-out scraping, like something being pulled slowly closer to the surface. It ended with a metallic click from somewhere deep inside the system, and then silence again. In the observation bay, Whitman's pen stopped moving. "That's it," he said quietly. "End it." The technician's hand went to the kill switch, but before it could be thrown, the vent released a sudden burst of freezing air so strong it rattled the metal frame. C's hum cut off mid-note. The lights in the chamber flickered once, twice, and when they steadied again, all 5 subjects were facing the vent, motionless. The technician's voice shook slightly. "Vitals." The screen showed all readings steady, but not one of them moved, not even to blink. Whitman's eyes stayed fixed on the scene, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mark this as the end of silence." The chamber was still, unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that makes the air feel thicker, as if movement itself had been switched off. All 5 subjects remained facing the vent, their bodies upright but loose, their hands hanging at their sides. The monitors reported normal respiration, steady heart rates, no irregularities. Yet no one blinked, no one shifted their weight. No one seemed to notice the world beyond that narrow strip of metal on the wall. Whitman stood at the glass for a long time before speaking. His reflection in the observation pane looked paler than he remembered. "Shut it down," he said at last. The technician hesitated. "All of it?" Whitman nodded. "Seal the vents, cut power to the chamber, and purge the line." The liaison picked up the phone to relay the order, his voice quick and clipped. But inside the chamber, nothing changed. The hum of the ventilation system ceased. The lights dimmed to emergency glow, and yet the 5 remained exactly as they were. The final entry in the experiment log was brief. Phase 2 concluded at 0413 hours. Subject behavior: Fixed orientation toward ventilation source. Unresponsive to external stimuli. Vitals stable. No signs of distress. No vocalizations after event marker 12. End of silence. Project terminated under Directive Epsilon, but not all records matched. Weeks later, in a separate, unsigned memorandum buried deep in the restricted archive, a single sentence appeared without context or explanation. Do not place any personnel in proximity to Vent Cluster 3A until further notice. It still knocks. The file was officially closed in December of 1953, but in the years that followed, maintenance staff reported odd occurrences whenever they worked in that wing. A chill in the air, no matter the season. Tools left in the open found rearranged in the shape of 3, 2, 3. One man claimed he heard humming through the wall, low, steady, and perfectly in time with the building's electrical pulse. He didn't come back the next day. The building was eventually abandoned, its windows boarded, its hallways empty, except for the slow creep of dust. But somewhere in the dark, behind the rusting vent covers and the forgotten ductwork, the air still shifts in cold, deliberate pulses. And if you stand close enough, just before the knock comes, you might hear a faint, familiar whisper. It's ready now.